And I think that in life, we get into these routines. We're in a town where we know everybody. We drive the same way to work every day. We have the same thoughts. We listen to the same music, same friends. It becomes, we stop noticing things. I think technology falls into the same group of things with money, beauty, power, fame, prestige. A little is a tonic, and there's a sweet spot, and when you get past that, it becomes toxic. To me, success is that you are doing the things that you want to do, and when you look at yourself in the mirror, you see someone that you admire.
You have found the Thinking Mind podcast.
Welcome back to the Thinking Minds podcast. Today it's Alex. I'm super happy to bring you a conversation with Dr. Chris Ryan. Chris Ryan is a podcaster and an author. He's written 2 books, Sex at Dawn, a book about non-monogamy, and Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress, a book about the dangers of modern civilization. He has his own podcast, Tangentially Speaking, about a wide range of topics, and he's made numerous guest appearances on the Joe Rogan Experience and the Duncan Trussell Family Hour podcast. It was a pleasure to have him on and have a wide-ranging conversation about his travels around the world, the dangers of technology, the role of serendipity in his life, the price of success, and many other topics. This is the Thinking Mind podcast. Here you can access conversations all about psychiatry, psychotherapy, self-development, and many other topics. If you'd like to support the podcast, do check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. And now here's today's episode with Dr. Chris Ryan. Today I feel really privileged to be here with Dr. Chris Ryan, PhD. Chris, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
My pleasure. I'm glad we could arrange it.
Without wanting to overwhelm you too much with flattery, I've listened to your podcast on and off since about 2016, I think. And I remember I was listening to one of your guest appearances, I believe on Joe Rogan. And it was really the time in my life when I first started listening to podcasts. And I'm not sure which episode it was specifically, but I just remember listening to it and starting to think, oh, okay, podcasts are not just an entertainment medium. Podcasts are actually something you can use to expand your mind. It's like, I felt like I was reading a book, but then importantly different from reading a book, right? Because what you're hearing are 2 people engaging in a dialogue in real time. So it was definitely for me a watershed moment, and listening to you and others is ultimately what motivated me to start my podcast. So it's a privilege to be able to have this conversation with you.
I'm happy to spread the good word of podcasting. It's changed my life for sure.
How did you start your podcast?
It started, I was living in Barcelona, and Sex at Dawn had just come out, and I was getting lots of media interview requests. And I got an email from a comedian named Duncan Trussell, and he said, yeah, I'm a comedian. I'm based in LA, and I'd love to have you on my podcast if you're going to be in LA at any time. And I think I had already planned a trip to LA to see my family a couple of weeks later. And so I had no idea what a podcast was. This was 2020, probably.
2010, you mean?
No, 2010. 2010, sorry, yeah. And, I'd never heard of podcasts. So, but I was interested in meeting a professional comedian. I thought that would be fun because I've always had a fascination with comedy, and particularly comedians who are truth tellers and dare to speak truth to power, like George Carlin. My dad loved George Carlin, and I remember he brought home a George Carlin record when I was probably 11 or 12 years old called Class Clown. And I love the sort of the daring to say the prohibited thing that some comedians specialize in. Anyway, so I went. I was in LA, and I went to the address that this guy gave me, and I thought it was going to be a radio kind of studio situation, and instead it was this little house. And I went in, and he had a couple of microphones on a table in front of the sofa in his living room. And he said, "You want a beer? You want to smoke some weed? Like, yeah, how are you? What do you want to do?" And I was like, "No, I don't. I don't know what's going on here." And we just sat down and we talked for a couple of hours. And it was awesome. It was really just super relaxing because it's so easy to forget the microphones are even there. You're especially in those days, I was very hyper aware of cameras and microphones because it was also new to me. And so this just seemed like such a relaxed way to do an interview. And I liked the fact that it was very open-ended. It wasn't like, okay, we got 7 minutes, to make your points, and we've only got 30 seconds left, but what do you think the future of sex is? Like I'd had so many of those interviews,
And they get
and
someone
it
on
was so
opposite
nice.
you to like debate you, and you did have the whole debate in like 5 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. I got ambushed a bunch of times like that. But but it was awesome. And then we went out for beers and some dinner afterwards. And Duncan said, "Dude, you should do a podcast. Like you meet all these interesting people. You got this big book out. Like, you're kind of everyone wants to talk to you now. You've got access." And I said, I didn't know anything about audio. And I was like, oh man, no, microphones and mixers. And yeah, I don't know anything about that stuff. And he said, "Oh, I got a guy, put you in touch with him. He'll tell you what to buy. It's like $300 for everything you need. You've already got a laptop." And this guy just made it really easy for me. He's like, "Okay, look, buy this, 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 and this. Here are the links, and record it, send me your raw files, I'll mix it for you." And so that's how it started. And then later I ended up learning how to mix it myself, and it's super easy once learn how to do it. um and I had no idea. And Duncan, at that point, Duncan said, he was like, "Man, I make like $2,000 a month on this. This is awesome. All I do is hang out and talk to people." Duncan's probably making,
Way more now.
$50,000 a month
Mm.
at this point. Yeah. But at that point, a couple $1,000 a month, that's like what I lived on. So I thought, geez, if I could make a couple $1,000 a month just talking to interesting people, I'm down with that. And I always, like, when I was a kid and I watched talk shows on TV, um, I always thought there were some like the super late night ones. Like I lived around New York in the 70s, I guess it was. There was a guy named Tom Snyder or Charlie Rose, like those talk shows where you had time and you're just sitting at a table talking to, Quentin Tarantino or something for an hour about, his approach to movie making. That just seemed like the best job in the world, you know, talking. And I used to hitchhike a lot as a kid. Um, as a like teenager, I hitchhiked from New York to Alaska and back twice. And I hitchhiked down the West Coast. I hitchhiked from Montreal to New York. It's crazy. I would never do it now or recommend it. But I liked that feeling of a car stopping and you have no idea who you're going to be talking to, right? But you just have to like enter the conversation with a sense of,
Make do.
yeah, and a sense of gratitude, right? Because they stopped. Whoever it is, whatever their agenda is, lots of times it was someone trying to push their religious beliefs, or, a lonely homosexual, looking for a connection, whatever. As long as they weren't, aggressive or trying to hurt me or something, I really enjoyed the kind of Aikido of rolling with whatever energy, whatever vibe that was going on inside the car. And I feel like there's some of that with podcasting as well.
Yeah, there's a parallel, I think, between good conversation and something that I think particularly that we need in the West in life, which is at least for moments, the relinquishing of control. and they sort of surrender to what's going to happen next. And as you say, the Aikido, the ability to move with what's going to happen next, to surrender to what's going to happen next. I mean, in conversation, we know about this really in the psychotherapy world, where one of the main dictates is like the less pressure and the more spontaneity, the more positive work gets done in a therapy session. If the environment is relaxed, if there isn't a lot of tension, if the environment is non-judgmental, that gets the client in a space where they start to talk in a more spontaneous, free associative manner. And then the real magic, which happens, I think, both in therapy and podcasts, is when the client or the podcaster is in the zone where they don't know what they're going to say next. So they're at that learning edge. And it's quite a beautiful thing. What do you think that, I'm guessing the answer is yes. Do you think that serendipity, I mean, even your story with Duncan Trussell highlights this, but do you think serendipity has played a big role in your life? Are there things that you do to try and allow space for serendipity in your life?
Yeah, I think serendipity is, one of my closest friends probably. And as far as opening up space for that energy, I think the thing I've probably done intentionally that's had the most effect on that is the years I spent traveling. I mentioned going to Alaska when I was in college, and I skipped my junior year and went to Alaska because I had this idea that I wanted to see a frontier, and that was kind of the last frontier. I wanted to, be able to stand on the edge of consensus reality and look out at endless wilderness, and I did that. And also I took a lot of psychedelics in those days for the same reason, probably, that it felt very much like it was opening possibility. And I think that in life we get into these routines. We're in a town where we know everybody, we drive the same way to work every day, we have the same thoughts, we listen to the same music, same friends. It becomes, we stop noticing things, right? Because we're just doing the same thing. It's like if you ate the same food every day, you'd stop tasting it, right? And so yeah, for me it was very important to open up the doors of perception, whether through psychedelics or extreme experience of other sorts, and putting myself in very unfamiliar environments, whether that be India or relationships with women from other cultures. I found like very interesting and enlightening. And of course, when you're traveling like that, when you really open yourself up like that, all sorts of crazy things happen, that seem supernatural. But I'm convinced that those things are happening all the time. We just don't notice them because we're in our ruts, we're wearing the blinders of routine.
Yeah, there's a magic in the everyday that gets missed because our brain is constantly filtering stuff out. And it's like, okay, this part of your environment is predictable, therefore you no longer need to notice it. But then you travel, you go somewhere new, your brain has to, almost as a survival mechanism, be like, okay, now we have to start paying attention because the road signs aren't the same, the language isn't the same, the weather isn't the same, the accents aren't the same.
I'm thousands of miles from anyone. Yeah, exactly. It's almost a survival instinct.
Yeah, it like jogs you out of a mental stuckness.
Yeah.
And I think we can all resonate with the idea of feeling very stuck in our lives and not knowing what to do, not knowing how to. And I think traveling is obviously I think traveling is probably the most under-discussed way of getting unstuck, because I've never really heard it discussed, although personally I've always found it to be very effective. And of course, psychedelics, we're starting to research them very, very aggressively for clinical things in clinical applications like depression, anxiety, trauma, which are all, in a sense, they're versions of being stuck. Like depression, your mood is low, your motivation is low, your energy is low, your appetite is low, everything is telling you that not to move forward, everything is telling you to stay in place. And from that place, it's very difficult to do the things that you would need to alleviate your symptoms. So we try, with psychotherapy and conventional medications, and they work. But perhaps I think these novel ways are good. Are there any sort of commonsensical means that you've used to manage your mental health over the years? Am I right in saying you're thinking about writing a kind of parody of a self-help book where you might talk about managing mental health?
Yeah. I'm thinking about it and talking about it too much.
Mhm.
It's a bad habit I have of, you know, airing out ideas, which then can take some of the air out of the balloon or out of the sails. But yeah, as far as I think I'm very fortunate in terms of mental health. I think, whether it's genetics or childhood experience, lack of serious trauma as a child, I think I don't carry anywhere near as much weight as many people do in that area. And so I feel a lot of compassion for people um, who haven't been as fortunate in that regard. As far as, when I mean, there have been times in my life that I look back, one time in particular, where I look back and I think I was probably clinically depressed at that point. But at the time I didn't know it. Right. I just, and the reason I think that is it was the only time in my life where I felt like I don't care if I pay the rent this month. Right. Like normally I'm very fastidious about paying my bills, paying my debts. It gives me a sense of pleasure like that. I can check that off the list, even though I never had money until Sex at Dawn came out and I was, 40 or almost 50 at that point. I was, teaching English and just scrambling for money all the time. So maybe that's why I was very attentive to it. I always knew exactly how much money I had. Um, and but yeah, that was a time where I was just like, I don't give a shit, and I remember spending like 4 days in my apartment with the curtains drawn and never leaving. And like, that's very unusual for me. But I would say that uh, walking, just getting out of the house and getting into nature has been helpful. Jumping in cold water is
Mhm.
amazingly
I've tried
helpful.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Not only, I know Wim Hof and I've been in his ice barrel and I know his kids and I did a podcast with him and we got to be friends and we've hung out all over the world since then. And I really admire what he's doing, but I think that a lot of the benefit of cold plunge is just the sort of cognitive experience of deciding to do something, having your body rebel against it, and overruling the rebellion of your body and saying, no,
Mm.
I'm doing this anyway. And then having the feeling of like, holy shit, I feel really good. And I think just going through those 4 steps, right? I want to do it. I don't want to do it. I'm doing it anyway. Oh, it feels really good. The more time you do that sequence of events, the more control you have over your life and your emotional life as well. In a relationship, I don't want to have this difficult conversation. I don't want to admit that I'm not happy. I don't want to get into this awkwardness about our sexuality isn't compatible. I don't know. I don't want to do that. But the longer you don't do it, the
The
longer
worse it
you're
gets.
like the person standing next to the stream saying, I want to go in, but I can't go in. I want to go in, but I can't go in. You need to just take the jump and do the thing that you really need to do.
Which is quite a Joe Rogan way of thinking about it. He calls it silencing your inner bitch.
Yeah. Yeah. That's an area where Joe and I sort of don't see things exactly the same way. Like, I he's all about taming your inner bitch, and nature is a nasty, horrible Hobbesian. And my feeling is like, no, I think nature is indifferent, at worst indifferent, and at best offers us incredible gifts. And I feel like there's a lack of gratitude in the Hobbesian, the neo-Hobbesian view that we're in this, death struggle with nature. uh I feel like nature is incredibly generous and has given us so much more than was necessary. um but that, yeah, Joe and I sort of see things differently in that respect. And he's way more disciplined than I am.
Mm.
I mean, I don't work out all the time, or you know I hunt all my meat, or like he does. I don't know how he finds time to do all this shit that he does.
Yeah.
I'm much less ambitious, and that's part of this book idea that I have, is like, it is like, and I'm not talking about Joe here, but there's a certain point where the sort of desire for total human optimization becomes a burden, you know like, oh, I got to get my body fat down to 15%, and I got to be able to do 100 pull-ups, and I got to have the abs, and I got to it's like you spend your whole life worrying. It's all vanity, man. You're going to die. I don't give a shit how many push-ups you can do. You're still going to die. And there's a guy, I don't know him, but he wrote a book called Nothing Can Hurt Me.
David
And every time I
Goggins.
heard that, I was like, it's like, dude, there are a million dogs that can hurt you, not to mention bears and lions and tigers and cancer and a brick to the back of the head or a pencil in your fucking eye. Like, I don't care if you're a Navy SEAL, superstar. You can be hurt by any number. You can fucking stub your toe and get an infection and die. I mean,
Mhm.
lots of things can hurt you. So I feel like we need a sense of humility, and that humility can actually be a very liberating
Yeah.
experience.
Humility and a sense of surrender. I mean, I think what you're saying is very important because there's a era of internet culture which maybe it's still peaking. I don't know if it's past its peak, but I think the phrase total human optimization covers it, which is the Tim Ferriss, Joe Rogan, maybe Modern Wisdom more lately trend, where this idea of controlling as much of your life as possible to orchestrate peak performance. And I'm not criticizing it, in that I think it's a message so many people who aren't taking control of their lives can benefit hugely from. And I see it all the time in the people I see clinically. Like, to have to assert more control over your life, take more responsibility, can be so beneficial. But what you're pointing out is there are limits to it. There is a point it can get to where it becomes frank lack of humility and intense self-criticism, and it becomes self-flagellation.
Yeah.
I think where I ultimately land on it is, I think, like, stable, sustainable self-improvement really requires a paradoxical combination of the ability to challenge oneself and then the ability to be compassionate towards oneself. And I think what those mirror essentially is a more paternal and maternal style of parenting. The paternal being more of the encouragement to take risks, to go and explore new territory kind of parenting, and the maternal more of the unconditional, more of the here's a place you can come and rest and you have value no matter what. And that's kind of where I've landed on the self-improvement thing.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it. Another paradigm that I tend to see the world through is hunter-gatherer versus farmer. So, most of our existence as a species by far was spent as hunter-gatherers. And hunter-gatherers don't seek to control their environment, right? They don't. That all started with farming. So a hunter-gatherer approach to life is one of assumed abundance, where whatever I need, I'll find it when I need it. So if storm clouds are coming in and it looks like the weather's going to get bad, I know how to build a hut in 10 minutes from stuff that's all around me, right? I get an infection, well, I know where the medicinal herbs are. Hungry, I know how to hunt rabbits or ducks or whatever, dig up tubers and eat berries. Like I know how to move through the environment in such a way that I can always take care of myself. Whereas a farming approach is we need to, get rid of the pests. We need to condition the soil. We need to plant at a certain time. We need to control the water through irrigation or whatever. We need to harvest. We need to save that harvest for the next harvest, which isn't going to be till a year. So it's a whole different way of looking at life. I've written about this in both of my books. And what's interesting is that, we're taught that civilization, which obviously grew out of agriculture and, settled communities, has given us this incredible abundance. But ironically, what it's also given us is a sense of scarcity, an overwhelming sense of scarcity. There's never enough. We need to save for a rainy day. We need to, salt away money in our 401k retirement accounts. We need to worry because there's never enough, because we're totally reliant on whatever we've saved, our little fortress walls to protect us from the world, which is that, Joe Rogan, neo-Hobbesian, nature's a nasty bitch. Whereas hunter-gatherers who have practically nothing in terms of material possessions don't see the world as threatening at all. They see it as welcoming and providing, and that even extends into, sort of religious understanding of things, right? The Old Testament God is capricious and vengeful and jealous. It's like a, alcoholic, abusive parent, whereas hunter-gatherers who are animists tend to see the supernatural world as giving and kind and loving. These things break down into very interesting parallels in all sorts of ways. And I think your parenting idea is true as well. The father is like, go out there and get it done and take a risk, and the mother's like, oh, you hurt yourself, come here, I'll take care of you.
And the irony of it is, because I do think, based on what I've seen clinically and what I've read, I do, although I wouldn't necessarily throw out the idea of civilization entirely, and I'm not I doubt that you do as well. I do think the trappings of modernity, especially as it starts to accelerate, are responsible for the development of a lot of mental health symptoms. Because the irony is, even though we're a lot safer than we've ever been, we're a lot more anxious, because the relationship between safety and worry and anxiety is counterintuitive. Most people intuitively think the safer I am, the less worried I'm going to be. And that's true in the very short term. But in the long term, because you're disconnected from reality, like I have a whole audio essay about like connecting more with reality. But the more disconnected you are about you are from reality, the more you exist in fantasy world. And nowadays we really exist in a fantasy world, technologically speaking. The more worried you are, because you're not constantly testing yourself against the kinds of ups and downs that a more naturalistic landscape provides, I suppose. So all of that being the case, both of your books, you're deriving the wisdom of our ancestral past. That being the case, that you've dived into this so deeply, where do you stand now? Like, what's your relationship with technology? What's your relationship with society, knowing what you know? Are there things that you do to kind of attenuate the sort of, I think you've used the word tentacles before, the tentacles of modernity in your life?
Yeah, I think I have a very sort of wary and reluctant attitude toward technology. I'm like a mouse who really wants to nibble at the cheese, but knows that it's in a trap. So I kind of come in and nibble a little bit and try to get out before it catches me. Yeah, I feel, I use technology, where I consider it to be an advantage, like talking to you right now. Podcasting, is obviously a use of technology that I think is beneficial both for me personally and for humanity in general. I think the fact that you and I can have a conversation and talk about absolutely anything we want, and then you press a few buttons and as many people as want to can listen to it. I think that's a unique, incredibly powerful thing. I don't know how long it'll last, historically speaking, but to me, it seems on a par with the invention of the printing press as far as its potential, um, both positive and negative, to change the world. Yeah, it's interesting. People say, "Oh, you could change the world." They always presume it's for the better. Hitler changed the world, right? Like a lot of
Good
these,
point.
he went out and changed the
Yeah.
world. Well, yeah, he fucked it up. Um, but anyway, I think that I try to use technology the same way. I think technology falls into the same group of things with money, beauty, power, fame,
Mm.
prestige. A little is a tonic, and there's a sweet spot, and when you get past that, it becomes toxic. And so I learn a lot watching YouTube videos, but I also sometimes sit here all fucking morning watching YouTube videos, one after another, and then it's like, oh, I was supposed to like change the oil in the car and do practical things today, and instead I sat here watching YouTube videos. There's some educational value in that, but it certainly isn't doing my body any good to be sitting in a chair for 4 hours forgetting where I am. So I think for me, because I'm not very disciplined, I need to make structural changes in my life that force me to do the things that I want to do. So I live right now in the smallest, tiniest little town nobody's ever heard of unless they listen to my podcast. There are no red lights. There's no Walmart. The closest Walmart's an hour away from here. Um, so that kind of forces me to spend time in nature because that's all there is here is beautiful mountains, and it's a high desert, and you go outside at night and you see every star in the Milky Way, and it's absolutely beautiful. So I've put myself in a place where I not only have access to nature, it's kind of unavoidable. And I find that's really good for my peace of mind and my physical health, because it encourages me to go out and ride my bike and walk and just get out and do things. But yeah, I think technology is, it's like so many other tools, although I don't think that it's a 50-50. I don't agree with people who say technology is just a tool. You can use it like a knife for, carving things and making dinner or killing someone. It totally depends on you. I agree with Tristan Harris and others who have written about technology. I think it definitely pulls us toward the negative, and so we have to be extremely vigilant about not getting into Twitter fights and getting depressed because we're spending too much time looking at the illusion of how wonderful everyone else's life is on Instagram. Like it once, the attention economy is the phrase that's used now, and so we need to guard our stores of attention very jealously and vigilantly, because these technologies are parasites and our attention is really all we have.
Yeah, I guess the difference is you take something like a knife is static, like a knife doesn't change. A knife can be seductive, if you have murderous thoughts, but you have to have the murderous thoughts. Whereas the difference between a knife and modern technology is modern technology changes itself to become ever more seductive and appealing. Twitter is constantly adjusting the algorithm to entice you more, and it's very interesting to think about.
I would just to get back to this whole thing about the neo-Hobbesian world, and how Joe and I sort of differ on that. I think that the modern world differs from the natural world in exactly what you just pointed out. that a lot of the modern world is designed specifically to fuck us over, designed by engineers, by marketing professionals, designed to take our health, take our free time, take our attention, and use it for their benefit to our detriment. Whereas the natural world, as I was saying earlier, is by and large indifferent. Yes, there are a couple of predators who would probably be happy to eat a human, but they learned hundreds of thousands of years ago that humans are more trouble than they're worth in terms of, these guys have spears, they have, spear throwers, they can hit me from way beyond where I can get to them. Better leave the humans alone, and they're not that delicious anyway. Much better to go after deer and elk and whatever. So I don't think, even in terms of predation, that humans have really had much to worry about by and large. The world is much more hostile now than it ever was to our ancestors.
And it's hostile. The way that modernity is hostile is very different, because nature is hostile perhaps in a more acute sense. A weather storm can take you out, or a predator can take you out quickly. The modern world takes you out slowly. It's chronic. It's like diabetes after 30 or 40 years of eating food. When you were describing the design component, I obviously thought of hyperpalatable foods, the way foods are designed to tempt you as much as possible, down to the level of texture and crunch and flavor combinations. Yeah. It's quite it's crazy to think about. It's
devious.
It's devious. Obviously, the goal of a company is financial, but in pursuit of that goal, there are many people who suffer.
Yeah, by design. I just did a podcast the other day where I put together a list of things that are collapsing or or already collapsed, ranging from ocean ecosystems, global climate systems, to respect for institutions like the Supreme Court or Congress or journalism. We live in an extremely hostile world. And one of the worst things about it is that it's constantly telling us how safe we are, And so, and you talked about earlier how the sort of mismatch between, we are disconnected from reality, and that manifests in psychological problems. Show me a chimpanzee in the wild that's safer than the chimpanzee in a zoo. Right? Nothing's going to hurt the chimpanzee in a zoo. There are no predators that are going to sneak into its cage. But the chimpanzee in the zoo is probably pulling its fur out and going crazy because it's in a fucking cage. But objectively, it's safe, right? Objectively, but it's totally disconnected from the life it was designed to live. So it goes crazy.
Yeah, safe in just an acute sense.
Right. Yeah, Robert Sapolsky wrote a beautiful book outlining what you're talking about, this chronic versus acute stress, called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. So anyone who wants to educate themselves about that, that's an excellent book to read. And he makes that point that acute stress, like a potential attack by a predator or a storm, or, you almost fell and hurt yourself, it comes quickly and it goes quickly. And you either die or you don't. But you don't lie around for 30 years worrying about it. Can I pay my mortgage? Is my insurance going to work if I get cancer? These things, there's no answer to this. There's no way to make them go away. So you just sort of ruminate on it. And eventually those are the things that will get you a lot faster and more efficiently than a predator.
Through heart disease, which is tremendously influenced by stress, for example.
Yeah.
And one thing I'm curious about is, so you attain success late in life, which I imagine must be way more beneficial than getting success early in life, when people tend to be more impulsive and more easily move with the tides. And I want to talk more about the stress of success, because it's probably difficult for people to talk about. It's difficult for successful people to talk about because they feel like they should be grateful for their success, and of course they should. But the impression I get from as an outsider is that I think success can be extremely stressful and taxing and seductive in a harmful way, much like technology. What was your experience of sort of quite quickly getting success as an older person like for you?
Well, you know, uh, I have a habit of questioning the premise, so pardon me if this is annoying, but the first thing I would want to do is say, what do we mean by success? Right? I guess you're referring to success as manifested by some money and some fame, some access to famous people, and like going to fancy parties in LA or whatever. And yeah, that kind of success came quite late in life. But to me, success is that you're doing the things that you want to do. And when you look at yourself in the mirror, you see someone that you admire, more or less. Not someone who's perfect, not someone who never makes mistakes, not someone who has no regrets, but someone who's basically a good person, who's trying, who's doing interesting things, who is living a life that's in alignment with their own integrity and their own values. And in that respect, I think I've almost always considered myself to be successful. There have been times when I veered from that path, and that was challenging and interesting and enlightening in some ways. But I worked my way back to the path.
What are
And
the things that caused you to veer from the path, do you think?
the first time it was opportunity. So what happened was I went to Alaska. I told you I skipped my junior year of university. I went to Alaska. I got a job working in a fish cannery, gutting salmon, and I made some, $7,000 or something, which at the time seemed like a lot of money. And then I went back and did my last year of university. Um, and then I went back to Alaska and got a job on a boat. And when I was in Alaska, before I went to Alaska, I should say, I had a sort of life path envisioned. I had a friend who was a professor at Oxford. He's not only a professor, he was very famous. He was the youngest person to ever be a Don at Oxford since 1520 or whenever Oxford was founded. He was a big star there. And he's a friend of mine. He was a professor at this university I went to, and we became friends. And he said to me, like, dude, if you want to go to graduate school, I'll get you into Oxford. You can stay at my rooms. I'll introduce you to everybody. Um, and so that was what I was planning to do. I was going to go get a PhD in literature, be teaching, at Princeton or someplace, and have tenure by 30. And that was my thing. That was what I had, support and talent and passion. I love literature. I love reading. I love writing. But what happened was I went to Alaska and I had these incredible experiences hitchhiking and meeting people who had no idea who W.H. Auden was, or Dostoevsky, or Joseph Conrad, or Herman Melville, or any of these people that I was so into. They had no idea. They were, they were what we would consider ignorant, uneducated, but they knew how to build a house. They knew how to take care of the car. They had cool dogs. I remember this one guy, he took me to his house and I slept on his sofa, and his wife and his kids, and he had built the house himself, and his wife was awesome, this gorgeous, beautiful, happy woman, and they had these great kids and these great dogs. And this guy probably didn't graduate high school, right? And here I was with 20 pounds of, D.H. Lawrence's selected poetry and in my backpack. and and I could hardly, hang a picture on the wall without fucking everything up. And it just illuminated for me how you could be super smart and super educated and totally stupid at the same time. And I looked back at some of my friends at university, and I saw how unhappy they were, and ultimately kind of incompetent, except, the only thing they were good at was the things that they did to get their PhD and teach, and which was great, but they were kind of helpless in the wider world, and they were deeply unhappy. And so I remember exactly where I was. I was sitting on this particular place in the bluff in Kenai, Alaska, and I thought, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be that person. I want to see the world and interact with the world immediately, not by way of a novel or by way of someone teaching me in a classroom. I want to taste it in my own mouth. And so I decided I'm not going to go to graduate school. I was 20, I think, at the time. And I said, I'm not going to go to graduate school. I'm not going to go to medical school, because I was kind of thinking about that as a possibility. I'm not going to get married. I'm not going to have a career. I'm not going to commit to anything until I'm 30. So I'm going to spend the next 10 years just opening up to serendipity. I'm just going to see what happens. I'm going to just follow wherever the winds take me. And so what happened was I decided to go and live in New York for a little while. So this is 1984, because there was a woman there that I'd had a relationship with, and I wanted to sort of explore that relationship. And also I had never lived in a big city. And I thought, I'll go to New York, and I'll drive a taxi, or I'll work in a restaurant, or whatever, I'll just exist and survive. And I'll have this experience of seeing what's up with her. And also I'll have this experience of being in a big city. And, that's something I want to do. So I went to New York and got a job in a restaurant owned by some people my parents were friends with or something. And after a couple of weeks, there was this guy, and he was eating alone. He was having dinner, and it was late. And he was reading The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which was my favorite novel. I'd read it probably 3 or 4 times at that point. And I said something about the book, and we started chatting, and he said, you want to help me finish this wine? He had a bottle of wine, and I was like, yeah, there's nobody here, whatever. So I sat down, had some wine with him. And then he invited me to meet him at his gym the next day. And I thought, okay, that's probably this dude's gay, but he didn't seem gay. And I don't care. I had lots of gay friends. I wasn't threatened by that. I'm not gay, but we can hang out, whatever. I met him at the gym, and I was very naive to New York. I didn't know it's called the New York Health and Racquet Club. And this is like a 5-star hotel gym. You go there, and, they take your coat and, hand you a robe, and, it's this kind of fancy, ridiculous, like where Bill Clinton would go to work out when he was in town or something. And so I'm there in this gym, and it's all really kind of awkward and weird. I've never been in a gym like this. And I'm with this guy, and his name was Joe. He was about 10 years older than me. He was in his mid-30s. And he was asking me all these weird questions, right? Like, it was like a 2-track conversation. So one track was literally questions like this, like, do you think people can change, or are we just born with our personality in a fixed state? And what do you think happens after we die? What do you think are the most common mistakes that people make around your age in their 20s? Like really deep, profound questions. But then the other track, I remember he said to me, when you go back to your apartment tonight, if the lights don't work, what would you do? And I said, I checked the fuse box. And he said, okay, where's the fuse box? I said, it's in the kitchen. How many circuits does it have? 3 circuits. How many amps? I think 15 amps. Okay. What do you think happens when we die? It was like, it was this crazy thing. Anyways, this is a long story, but basically what happened is this guy had just inherited about $50 million worth of real estate. in Midtown Manhattan in the Diamond District, it's called, which is 47th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. And he was looking for an assistant because he wanted to do other things. So he was looking for someone to manage the real estate, these commercial buildings, so he would be freed up to do other entrepreneurial things. And so he was basically interviewing me for a job. And he ended up offering me this job, and I took it. And within a year of arriving in New York, I was living in a penthouse apartment on Fifth Avenue, rent free. I had a BMW car in a garage I could use whenever I wanted. He and I would fly to Montreal for dinner on his private jet. It was this crazy, I was 22, 23, something like that. I was making more money than my dad made, who was a vice president of an insurance company at the time. It was like I just fell into this crazy life in the mid 80s, making all this money, like living, all my friends were like, what? You studied like Marxist literary criticism and now you're making six figures and you're like, what the fuck? So that was a challenge because ultimately Joe and I became very good friends. But my vision was I was going to go travel around the world. I was going to backpack around the world and go to India and trek in Nepal and, have all this serendipity in my life. And instead I'm wearing a 3-piece suit and I'm negotiating leases with Hasidic Jewish diamond dealers from Rotterdam. It was like, what the fuck is this? So initially it was really gratifying because it was so outside of the realm of expectation.
You couldn't
I knew
design a more
nothing.
seductive setup.
Well, yeah, I mean, initially because of the knowledge and experience, right? Like, I'd never even lived in a city, and here I am negotiating leases with Russian immigrants. It was just like I didn't know this world existed, and now I'm kind of like thrust right into the middle of it. I'm not even Jewish, and everyone was Jewish there. And but then as the novelty wore off, I started to feel like I'd sold out. Like, okay, now this is just about money. And I'm trading my time for money. And it's a lot of money, but still, that's my time. This is my 24th year of life. It's never coming back. What's that worth? And so I did that for a couple of years, and then I was getting more and more unhappy. I remember we had a conversation where I said to him, I want to travel, I want to see the world. And he was like, dude, we'll fly to Agra and stay at the Ritz and go see the Taj Mahal, like we could do whatever. And I said, that's not what I mean. Like, I don't want to be in the 5-star hotel. Like, that's not really the way I see life. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not what I was looking for. I was looking for experience and wealth. I realized at that age, wealth insulates you from experience. People think wealth brings the opportunity for experience because they see these guys going down to the Titanic for $250,000 or, whatever, you can go into orbit or something. Okay, but the rest of the time you're living behind walls and bulletproof glass and climate controlled, and you don't trust your friends, and it's a fucking nightmare. Anyway, so I eventually I quit that job and I bought a one-way ticket to India. And so that was, when you say, what were the temptations? That was the first one. I feel like I had veered way off my path, and it was like the biggest cold plunge ever to quit that job and fly to India.
It requires so much trust in your intuition and to know what your values are to take a plunge like that. Most people don't seem to have that, especially at that young age.
Yeah, I think the psychedelics had been a help, in terms of just sort of seeing through my own bullshit and confronting fears and sort of, establishing a relationship with my own authenticity. and a lot of the books that I read, because all the books that was most interested in were books about like getting real with your life. So, I mentioned before Herman Melville, Joseph Conrad, Henry David Thoreau, Emerson, the American Transcendentalists. They're called because they're very much kind of like Buddhists speaking American English. All those books are about cutting through the bullshit and getting down into the real, blood and guts of life, and not wasting your time on superficial nonsense. So even though they're books, and ultimately I decided I wanted to have my own immediate experience, it was because I admired those guys. I mean, Herman Melville worked on a whaling ship, and Joseph Conrad did captain a boat up the Congo River later to write Heart of Darkness. So, the writers I admired most were people who had done the things they were writing about. And I wanted to be one of those people. I didn't want to just be someone who wrote about people who wrote.
Yes. And had you chosen the professor path, which maybe is a path I can relate to a bit more, it wouldn't have been wealth necessarily that insulated you from reality, but ideas and intellectualism. Like, we think of the intellect and develop your intellect as a unabated good. Like, it's just good to be smart, but there is a huge danger, I think, to getting so engrossed in ideas that you stop being in touch with reality. It's a huge danger in psychotherapy. Freud regarded it as a defense in intellectualizing, and we use that sometimes as a defense.
And who was more guilty of
And
that than Freud himself?
yeah, yeah. And the way I do my psychotherapy, and you'd know this if you've ever been a client of mine, is it's quite practical. So obviously we talk and there's ideas, and I mean, I love exploring ideas, but I love doing experiments as well. So if you have a specific issue, if you have social anxiety, you should be trying to talk to people in the real world. You should be getting that real experience. I love learning the theory about cognitive behavior therapy, how do your thoughts relate to your emotions, etc. But you have to go out there and do it.
Yeah.
Experience is the touchstone.
Yeah.
And I think pairing theory with experience is a deadly combination.
Yeah, I think in my own case, if I had gone the academic route, the danger would have been arrogance. Because when I was a kid, I moved a lot. I went to 3 different high schools, and so always knew, being the guy with no friends, and that whole challenge. And the way I dealt with that was by sort of leaning on a sense that I was smarter than everybody, which was not actually factually true. I mean, in one of the high schools I went to, I was one of the top students. And then I went to another high school where everybody was super smart. And I was sort of, actually I was much happier because I had people who I could relate to there. But, my own sort of defense mechanism when I was challenged would be to retreat into this sense of intellectual superiority. And that experience I described earlier in Alaska, where I met people who, in a purely sort of IQ or how well read you are sense, I would have been much further along than they were. But in terms of actual, creating a life of happiness and contentment and integrity and decency and all these things that matter so much more, ultimately, they were way ahead of me. And luckily, I wasn't so enclosed in my fortress that I couldn't see that. But, you said earlier, like, intelligence is sort of accepted as a good. I've come to see intelligence as being similar to being tall. I don't think it's necessarily good. I think in many ways it can be a burden, because you're better at coming up with justifications that are so good even you believe them, and so you can get really trapped in your own nonsense, because you can if you're clever, you can like explain things in a way that other people are like, yeah, that makes sense. And so then you feed off that and you say, well, I must be right. Everyone thinks I'm right, but actually you're wrong. You're just smarter and you're better at, putting together a narrative. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, I think intelligence I see it as neither good nor bad. I see intelligence as good if it's nested within wisdom, which requires in most people, very proactive cultivation. I did a podcast maybe 2 or 3 years ago about the differences between intelligence and wisdom. And wisdom, I see it as a broader concern. And then within that, if you're also intelligent, then it's amazing because intelligence is like an engine that solves problems. And then the question is, solves problems to what end? And that's where wisdom comes in, and values, and a more general orientation and direction. That's kind of how I think about it.
someone, I don't know who said this first, but I read somewhere, someone said, um, knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit, not a vegetable. Wisdom is not putting tomatoes in your fruit salad.
Yeah, exactly.
So the application of what right? Like people can know so much, but they misapply it. They, and I don't think I ever really answered your question about, I was questioning your premise of what is success for 20 minutes, but I don't think I answered your question.
Yeah, and to be honest, you know how like people are honored when like South Park makes fun of them because I feel very honored that you question my premise because I've heard you question the premise, so
Yeah.
I feel a bit honored. But please, tell me what it was
Very
like
good.
to be in that place.
Uh, I feel I feel like sort of an undercover agent behind enemy lines in some ways. Like because all this stuff happened to me. So this happened when in 2010 is when Sex at Dawn came out. So I was 48 years old, right? So I was fully formed. I was who I was going to be. No, there's not a lot of malleability in terms of ego or whatever at that age, at least not for me. And so I feel a strong sense of imposter syndrome, like when I'm on the Joe Rogan podcast or I'm giving a TED talk or I'm on some TV show or something, I feel like somehow they don't know that I'm not supposed to be here, So I just sort of slipped in the back door somehow. And so it does give me it gives me a feeling of like, I don't really give a shit about this because I was totally fine before any of this happened. So, I think a lot of people who get into that kind of world are desperate to stay there. They're pitching TV shows and they're trying to grow their podcast audience and they're trying to, oh, I got to get on Joe's show again because, people are forgetting who I am. And, I should live in a big city where people recognize me at Starbucks and I get that ego boost and all that. And I've kind of gone the other way. Like, I don't care. I'm happy to let that stuff go. Um, because I feel like someone told me this story at a party recently. They were at a dinner party. This guy's a filmmaker and he was making a documentary about some billionaire. I forget who it was. It could have been Bill Gates or somebody. And they're at the dinner table, and there's a famous writer there, William Styron, who wrote Sophie's Choice and some other books. He's a great writer. Has a history of clinical depression. He wrote a book about his experiences with depression, actually. Anyway, the billionaire got a phone call and he had to go to his office to take this important business call. And someone said to William Styron, has it ever occurred to you that this guy makes more money in an hour than you've probably made from all the books you've ever sold in your life? And William Styron said, yeah, but I have something he'll never have. I said, what's that? Enough. Right? Like that is such a luxury to have enough. And I feel like my journey through the world of, what we're calling success has been sort of illuminated by the fact that I had enough before it even happened, right? Like I had a rich life with great friends and wonderful women and great food and travel. I'd been around the world 3 or 4 times. I'd gone everywhere I possibly wanted to go. I'd had all sorts of wonderful experiences, and as I said earlier, I felt successful. So that feeling of success and being within my own integrity had nothing to do with how much money I was making or how many people recognized me in the street or any of that. So it was very easy for me to sort of, take a sip from the glass and put it back on the bar and walk away. I didn't need to keep going and going and going. So I think that my experience has been kind of unique because most people who get into that situation have worked very hard to get there. And so they're very they
Very
urgently,
attached.
yeah, they need to stay there. They need to fight to stay there. And I never felt that. I felt like I wrote Sex at Dawn because I had this knowledge and I thought it could help people. And I had no idea it was going to be successful. I had no idea it would even be published. I didn't know anyone in the world of publishing. I didn't know any famous authors. This was all just, it just felt like something that needed to be said. And I felt like I was in a position to say it. And things just took off like a rocket ship. Like I could tell you from 1 week to the next week, I went from, I don't think anyone's ever going to read this, to 15 different agents want to fly me to New York to convince me to let them
Mm.
represent me. Like in a week that happened. Like, what are you talking about? Like, what? And then
It must have been dizzying.
it was crazy. Yeah, it was crazy. And then when the book came out, I remember, so we worked really hard to get it done and deadlines and all this bullshit that you have to do after you write a book and approving covers and media plans and all this nonsense. And finally, for the pub date, Casilda and I said, okay, we had friends who lived in Amsterdam and we were going to do an apartment swap with them. And we said, okay, let's just, after all this work, let's take a week. We'll go to Amsterdam. We'll hang out. We'll just calm down and we went to Amsterdam. The book came out and suddenly the publisher was like, dude, you got to do media. Like they want you on NBC. The Times of London wants to fly a journalist to wherever you are and a photographer. And, and I was doing 10 interviews a day sitting at my friend's table on Prins Hendrikkade and just doing interview after interview after interview. And like, we hardly went out at all. It was just totally, like take
And how
advantage
was
of it.
that for you? Is part of you, what's your mental state you're doing when you're doing these interviews? Is part of you excited, part of you wary and skeptical? Were you more unified in how you were thinking about what was it like?
Definitely some wariness. Casilda and I had decided before the book came out that if we ever, if anyone ever read it or that we ever did any media, that we would not talk about our personal relationship at all, because we anticipated that people were going to try to, so are you guys, non-monogamous? Or, like they were going to try to make us emblematic of certain kinds of approaches to marriage or whatever. And also, Casilda is a psychiatrist and she has a lot of experience with um, being protective of her own privacy and also understanding how quickly admiration can transform into hostility. So
Yeah,
anytime,
splitting.
yeah, splitting, right. Anytime someone was like, "Oh my God, you're so great," she would just be like, "Oh, be careful, be careful," So there is,
How wise of
oh
her.
yeah, she's extremely wise. Um, and she's one of the reasons I admire her so much is, she did take this sort of academic medical school and, all that stuff. But then as soon as she finished medical school, she went back to Mozambique and worked as the only doctor in a rural area with, I think, about 10,000 people. And she was the only doctor. And she delivered babies and she held people as they died and she amputated limbs and she, you know, what's it called, where you release fluid from livers. And, she just did all this crazy heroic stuff, which put her directly, at a very visceral level in contact with human experience. So she wasn't like the, sort of, oh, intellectual, I'm going to go and study at the Jung Institute for 5 years. She was like down in the dirt in Africa. And yeah, so her approach to medicine and to life is extremely grounded and practical and yeah, fantastic. So she was very helpful in that. And she also said, like, I'm not doing any media. You because English is like her fifth language. She didn't want to,
Yeah.
she could be misunderstood or have trouble. And she was just like, I don't need that stress. You talk. You're a good talker, and it's your language.
And now I guess you've arrived at this nice hybrid where, because you obviously love exploring ideas and you love writing, so you have the intellectual flavor to your life, and yet there's a calmness to it, a groundedness and asceticism to it, which is it seems like a delicate balance, but looking from the outside, it looks really nice.
Yeah, it is nice. It's, you know, it's nice. Getting back to that story about enough, right? I think that, it was tempting. I was living in Los Angeles. I was, um, it's exciting. You go to these parties and you recognize half the people there, and and it's like I was represented by the same talent agency that represents half the movie stars you've ever heard of. And I'd go to the lobby and I'd be sitting next to someone like that I saw on TV the night before. And it's just like, but luckily I was old enough and experienced enough to realize, like, that stuff is it's like it's candy. It's sweet and it's colorful, but there's no nutrition to it. There's nothing. I mean, what am I actually going to get from this? Like, money? I have enough money. I don't need much money, because until I was 48, I had no money. I know how to live on very, very little money. That's probably the thing I'm best at. So I give away a lot of money. Like, whatever, I have enough. And so when you don't really need anything more than what you already have, it's interesting. It's very, like, you're not that tempted by anything, because, like, it's like when you're not hungry, the smell of food doesn't really tempt you very much, because you're full. You don't need it.
And you were surrounded by people who were very much in the opposite frame of mind. And do you find that because you came with this very relaxed, non-attached disposition, that people really found you calming and wanted to be around you, that ironically, because you didn't care, you were even more attractive socially in that environment?
I think in terms of wealth, it works that way. Like, I have some friends who are very wealthy, and I'm like their token normal person friend. Like, I'm the only guy on the yacht who doesn't have millions of dollars. And I've always felt that, like, well before I wrote any books or anything, I've had friends who were very wealthy, and I think they felt relaxed around me because they could sense, like, I wasn't angling for anything. Like, even this guy in New York who hired me, I remember saying to him when he offered me the job, I said, Joe, like, there are Harvard MBAs who would kill for this opportunity. you know, like I haven't taken a math class since high school. Like I'm not a business guy, right? And I remember he said to me, "How many of your friends studied business in college?" I said, "None of them. That's my point." He said, "Yeah, none of mine did either." Like, I don't want to hang out with a business guy all day, right? Like, you and I are going to spend a lot of time together. I want to be with someone who's interesting and we can have good friendship. And the rest of it's easy. The business shit's easy. I can teach that to anybody. So, you know, that was a case where the fact that I didn't, that I wasn't really interested in money gave me the opportunity to connect with so much money. It's kind of like I lived in a mansion in Barcelona for a few years, that the woman had converted into studio apartments. And everyone who lived there, except for the owner, Anna, and me, was a fashion model. So there were like a dozen fashion models and this old lady and me. And I'm not attracted to fashion models. I don't find that skinny, angry, pouty kind of vibe attractive at all, right? And the fact that I wasn't attracted to them sort of it confused them, you know, and so they were like, "What the hell's wrong with me? Why aren't you?" And I feel like it's that life works that way, right? If the less you're chasing something, the more available it becomes sometimes.
Are there any, one of the reasons I listen to your podcast, and what I find is I listen in phases. So there'll be 6 months where I don't listen, and then 6 months where I listen quite a lot. I find I'm not necessarily looking for content, specific things. I'm looking for a perspective, a wider perspective, the kind of things we've been talking about. Are there any like really common annoying misconceptions about your work or your general perspective that you want to clear up?
Um, well, I would say uh, Sex at Dawn is misinterpreted by a lot of people who haven't read it and they've just heard about it or they've seen it on someone's bookshelf or whatever. A lot of people think it's a book advocating against monogamy or advocating for, you know, orgiastic free love or wife swapping or cheating on your partner or something. And so when I have a chance, I try to put that to rest. It doesn't advocate for anything. The book simply says, you know, this is the nature of our species. Here's the evidence for that. And this is why it's very difficult for a lot of people to live a life of sexual monogamy because we are sexual omnivores. And the evidence for that is overwhelming. And so, you know, we're attracted to many different kinds of music and art and architecture and humor and, you know, whatever. Name anything, we're attracted to different manifestations of that thing. And so, of course, we're attracted to different people in different times of our lives and different sorts of experiences. And there's nothing shameful about that. And the fact that that has been shamed and labeled as unnatural by so many institutions, ranging from political to religious to medical, no offense, is a travesty and a crime against humanity. And so our motivation in publishing that book was to say to people, hey, it's not your fault that you feel this way. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And if you acknowledge these feelings, you'll have a much better chance of controlling your behavior than you will if you don't acknowledge these feelings, which is what you're told to do. So we saw it as a book that empowers people to live their lives however they choose to do so, but starting with a more realistic, less hostile self-understanding. So that's one thing. You know, when someone says, oh yeah, my husband cheated on me. And when I caught him, he said, well, you should read Sex at Dawn. It's totally natural. It's like, no, dude, there's nothing in Sex at Dawn that says it's cool to lie to your partner, right? Nothing. The opposite. The whole book is no, be honest with your partner, be honest with yourself. Start from there. So that pisses me off. Um, uh, yeah, I guess that's probably it. People, well, you have a podcast. I just did one the other day where I was ranting and kind of, you know, despairing at the fact that the world's melting down and, everything's falling apart and young people are experiencing anxiety and depression and self-harm more than ever in the recorded history. And no fucking wonder they are. They're coming to consciousness on a sinking ship. What else are they going to feel, right? And yet we're, medicalizing it and shaming it and condemning it, and oh, you're a snowflake and you're just not tough enough, and all this bullshit. And I was, going off, and it came out a few days ago, and since then I've probably gotten 50 emails from people, half of them saying, thank you, man, that needed to be said. I had to pull over the car and just because you were so right. And so, and the other half were saying, Jesus, you're so angry, what the fuck's wrong with you, man? You need to calm down, like you're just an angry old man. Like, that's the way it is. You put something out and you have no control over how people respond to it. And I found peace with that early on, so I don't really think about being misunderstood very much. I just sort of say what I have to say and let people have their own experience with that.
Yeah, it's probably a waste of cognitive bandwidth at the scale of when you're reaching thousands of people. I'm conscious of your time. We need to wrap up, but maybe as a close, what are the things at this time in your life? I think people savor different things at different times of their lives. What are the things you're savoring in your life at the moment?
Interesting question. I I hate to question the premise again, but I don't think it's changed very much. I think I savor the same things now that I did 30 or 40 years ago, uh, a good sleep, uh, good sex, intimacy, beauty, whether it's mountains or a woman or music or poetry, silence, and probably more than anything, the freedom to do what I want with my time.
Well, Chris, it's been absolutely lovely to speak to you. Thank you for your generosity and for your time. And I'd love to have you back at some point in the future.
Yeah, I'd enjoy that. Yeah, I'm happy to do this. I looked into your podcast and I saw how thoughtful and how interesting your mind is. So I thought it's always a good opportunity to meet somebody like that.
Thanks so much for listening this week. If you've got any feedback, as always, do get in touch. If you enjoyed the episode, why not give us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, because it really helps other people to find us. If you want to get in touch, you can find us on Instagram or Twitter, or you can drop us an email. And if you value the show more generally, why not buy us a coffee just to help keep us going? Thanks so much.